President Trump does not want Canada. President Trump wants Canada's untapped potential. And here's exactly how he's trying to get it. Bonjour amigos, welcome to the Calipolis. If you're new here, this is my Plato's Allegory of the Cave in Real Life series. And what I typically do in this series is I first go over Plato's allegory applied to different areas of life. But first I do it from a theoretical perspective, and then I take that theory and apply it in real life that can provide practical benefits to us. In this instance, though, I thought it would be more interactive or maybe even fun if we used a live issue and I provided the conclusion first, and then later, after the issue has concluded, we will go back to this video and I'll provide the theory into how I arrived at that conclusion. Then we can kind of unpack why I was right, hopefully, or why I was off. So this is going to be part one of two parts. I'm starting with the conclusion, and then we're going to come back after and then go over the theory. So my hook at the beginning there is essentially my thesis. I'm saying that President Trump does not actually want Canada, the whole 51st state talk, the annexation talk. Even I'll go as far to say as the pressure applied from the tariffs is all just smoke and mirrors or shadows on the wall. And what he's actually after is Canada's untapped potential. More specifically, he's after Canada's natural resources and a better military positioning in the Arctic for the United States. Now, again, if you're interested into how I came to that conclusion, you're going to have to stick around for part two, where I actually go through Plato's Allegory of the Cave. But if you've been following along, and even if you haven't been, I encourage you to go and watch some of my previous videos. It's good to try this for yourself. So take the facts of this issue that are available to you and try and analyze them through the lens of Plato's allegory and see if you arrive at the same conclusion as me, or maybe a different conclusion, or maybe you can try and guess how exactly I arrived where I am today. All right, so you might be thinking at this point that this isn't really a bold claim. President Trump and his administration have been pretty outright about their desire for Canada's natural resources and also better military positioning in the Arctic. However, I'm going to go as far to say as the Trump administration's strategy here has already been applied, and they intend on reapplying the same strategy or re-implementing the same strategy in the Canadian context. And here's why. So my thesis specifically refers to untapped potential, and there's a reason for that. But I can't really go into why that is my conclusion in this video without giving too much away of the theory about how I arrived there. So I'm going to have to hold off on that for now, but it is really interesting, and I promise I will come back to it. But the focus here is untapped potential, not realized potential or existing revenue, for example. Now that piece is important for this analysis because not all of, a good chunk of Canada's untapped potential is in the north. And why is that important? Well, I said before that I believe the Trump administration's negotiation strategy with Canada, has already been implemented in a different context. And they just intend on reapplying that same strategy in the Canadian context. That other context where it was already applied, Greenland. Now you may be thinking, well, Greenland was completely different. Greenland isn't even a country, it's a territory of Denmark, to which I would say you're right. However, Canada's north is comprised of 3 territories to Canada. Then you might say, oh, okay, but Greenland's population is only like 50,000 people, to which I would say you're right. However, each of Canada's 3 territories has a population just under 50,000 people. Even their GDPs are all eerily similar. So this could be an effective strategy in the Canadian context for the Trump administration, given that The three territories combined comprise over 40% of Canada's landmass, but less than 1% of the population. So the tariff talk, the 51st state talk, it applies pressure to the population, which is all down south, 99% of Canada's population. Whereas the prize, what I'm suggesting the Trump administration is after, is all up north with less than 1% of the population and 40% of the landmass. When we're thinking in terms of untapped potential, that's really something to consider. Now look at what happened with the situation in Greenland. President Trump's framework of a future deal on Greenland, which was announced earlier this year in Davos, specifically outlines what the Trump administration's ideal scenario would be. And what does that ideal situation include? Exclusive rights to rare earth minerals and an indefinite military presence. And another important observation of how that discussion went down, Trump administration withdrew their threats of tariffs on several other nations in exchange for that framework. Right? So the tariffs on larger populations than Greenland were used as negotiation leverage to get a framework agreement towards the actual prize, which is Greenland. And that's what I think is happening in the Canadian context. I think the tariffs being applied to the mass population, which is all down south, are being used as leverage in a negotiation to obtain the actual prize, which is all up north. So to summarize here, we can take a look at how the negotiations went with Greenland, where the Trump administration applied the annexation rhetoric, or threats, I should say, and used tariffs applied to much larger populations than Greenland, all as leverage to obtain the framework agreement for rare earth minerals and military presence in the north. You take Greenland as a territory and you see how similar that context is to Canada's north, the three territories in Canada, and you can see how the Trump administration might be applying the exact same strategy in the negotiations with Canada. Okay, so just to drive home my point a bit further here, I thought it would be helpful to take a visual look at what I'm trying to explain by taking a look at a map of the Arctic corridor, and we can just go over some of the points I just raised. So in the upper right corner there, we have Greenland with a population of 56,000 people and a GDP of 3.3 billion USD. Their main resources are rare earth minerals, number one globally, with 0 active mines, so immense untapped potential. Now remember, with Greenland, we do know a lot from the framework of a future deal, which the Trump administration was outright about with respect to their ideal scenario, which included exclusive rights to rare earth minerals and indefinite military presence, which is that better positioning in the Arctic. So keep that in mind when we move westward to the Canadian territories. If the Trump administration's ideal scenario in Greenland is one that includes exclusive rights to rare earth minerals and an indefinite military presence, perhaps the Trump administration's ideal scenario with Canada would include those same things with the three territories. Okay, so moving westward to Nunavut, we're in Canada now. Nunavut is a territory of Canada. It has a population of just over 41,000 people. Its GDP is $3.8 billion, and its main resources are zinc, copper, uranium, nickel, heavy and critical minerals, and base metals. So again, you can see the similarities there with Greenland. And then looking at it geographically, you can see how any advantage that Greenland would provide with respect to better military positioning in the north, surely those same advantages would be provided with military presence in Nunavut. So again, moving further west, we're looking at the Northwest Territories. This is again a territory of Canada. Its population is just over 44,000 people. Its GDP is $5.5 billion, and its main resources are rare earth elements and precious metals. So again, the same similarities between Nunavut and Greenland, you can also see with Northwest Territories and Greenland, including the advantages of a military presence with respect to better positioning in the north. And finally, moving west one more time, we've got the Yukon. The Yukon is a territory of Canada. Its population is just over 46,000 people. GDP is $3.5 billion, and its main resources are copper, zinc, gold, silver, lithium. Again, heavy in the base and precious metals. Once again, you can see the similarities between all three territories and Greenland, including the geographic advantage of a military presence with respect to better positioning in the Arctic. So the main point I'm trying to drive home here is that the three territories in Greenland are not only similar in geography, which is significant with respect to the Trump administration's stated priorities for better military positioning in the north, but all four territories are also very similar economically. All of their GDPs are in the same range, and their natural resources are all similar in nature. So when you think of a negotiation, which is essentially what this whole video is about, the Trump administration already used a particular strategy in its negotiations towards their framework of a future deal in Greenland. Given the similarities between Greenland's geography and economy and what it can provide the Trump administration with respect to the Trump administration's stated priorities, it is fair to assume or consider that the Trump administration would use that same strategy that was effective in the Greenland context in Canada with the three northern territories. And if you keep going west on this map, you can see that it kind of ends with Alaska, which of course is already a state of the United States of America. So you've got the framework of a future deal in Greenland in the east there, and you've got Alaska, which is already a part of America in the west. You can see how the three territories of Canada provide kind of a clean sweep from Greenland to Alaska. It's the same play 4 times: Greenland, Nunavut, Northwest Territories, Yukon, which would provide the Trump administration and the United States of America with its better military positioning in the Arctic, and also its acquisition of untapped potential. And again, I'm going to save my theory as to why I believe the Trump administration is hyper focused on untapped potential for my part 2, because I arrived at that conclusion using Plato's Allegory of the Cave. And that's, my whole niche of this channel. This is a philosophy channel, and I use Plato's Allegory of the Cave to provide clarity into real life matters. But just to get you on board with the whole untapped potential angle, I asked Claude to rank every country in the Americas in terms of untapped resource potential. So the methodology that we used was total known resource wealth times proportion that remains undeveloped. So countries with the largest gap between what they have and what they've extracted rank highest on the list of untapped potential. Countries with the smallest gap between what they have and what they've extracted rank lowest on the list of untapped potential. And what you'll see here is a pretty interesting list. Specifically, if you take a look at the top 4 countries in this ranked list of untapped potential, you'll notice there is something very similar between all of these countries with respect to their relations with the United States of America, more specifically, the current Trump administration. The top 4 countries in this ranked list of untapped potential Canada, Venezuela, Bolivia, and Greenland are all countries that the Trump administration has made aggressive, documented moves on almost from day one of President Trump's presidency in his current term. So, could this be a coincidence? Of course. These are just observations. Or is it a pattern? A pattern that could be driven by intent and not mere coincidence. In part two, when we break this down through the lens of Plato's Allegory of the Cave, we'll see how the shadows being projected on the wall by the puppeteers are not as random as prisoners in the cave believe. Another interesting ranking on this list is the United States coming in nearly dead last. The analysis indicated that the United States has a high total value, but that most accessible reserves are already in production. Very low untapped proportion. So when President Donald Trump says something like this,
we don't need their cars, we don't need their energy, we don't need their lumber. We don't need anything that they give. We do it because we want to be helpful, but it comes a point when you just can't do that. You have to run your own country. And to be honest with you, Canada only works as a state. It doesn't. We don't need anything they have.
The philosopher king thinks otherwise, right? And this list of untapped potential is a big hint on what America might need from not only Canada, but all of the higher ranking countries in this list of untapped resource potential. Now, how this plays out, I don't know. I think Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney has done a pretty good job at keeping his hand close, but there are some observations we can make that perhaps gives reason to believe that Canada's negotiation team has something cooking. For instance, Prime Minister Mark Carney has already passed legislation that would speed up the approval process for natural resource projects in Canada. That's significant because it makes him a more effective negotiator. So he is able to come to the table with actual assets to negotiate with, rather than having to rely on a lengthy process that can typically take years to access Canada's natural resources. He's passed legislation that, in theory, could allow him to really speed up that process to ensure that those assets are available when he needs them at the negotiation table. Along that same thinking, Prime Minister Mark Carney has secured a majority government, which again makes him a more effective negotiator. If in a minority situation, in theory, he might have to come back and negotiate with Team Canada. You have to negotiate with your own side in a minority government. But now that he's got a majority government, he can be more confident in his position as a majority leader in his negotiations with the Trump administration. In relation to that majority government that he's secured since the election, the floor crossers, as it's referred to in Canada, which just means that members of parliament who were elected in the last election under a different political party have crossed the floor to the Liberal Party, which is Prime Minister Mark Carney's party. I think those floor crossers might be an indication that the Prime Minister has something cooking. He's given those floor crossers a whiff and they want in the kitchen. This is completely speculative. I haven't seen anything about this in the news, but if you look at the economic sectors of the members of parliament who crossed the floor, in theory, they do stand to benefit from a better CUSMA deal, disproportionately so than other ridings across the country. Okay, so here's the list of the floor crossers and the main economic sectors in each of their ridings. I'm not going to go over this in detail, but just at a glance, you can see how the economic sectors in each of these ridings has a lot of skin in the game in a CUSMA negotiation. They have a lot to lose from an ineffective negotiation and a lot to gain from an effective negotiation. Every sector on this table depends on either US market access, energy trade terms, or resource development rights, the three things that Kuzma directly speaks to. Now, again, this could, of course, be a big coincidence, but it could also not be. Either way, it is a pattern and something worth considering when trying to understand what are shadows and what are the real objects in the cave, right? Essentially, trying to seek clarity on this matter. So, again, my analysis using Plato's allegory can't really provide a whole lot of insight into Canada's position in all of this, but I will say I'm of the opinion that the Prime Minister of Canada, Mark Carney, is in fact enlightened in the area of economics. I do not believe he's in the cave, um, which makes me think this is going to be a good negotiation, right? President Donald Trump, say what you want about him. I think he's proven himself to be a man who can get what he wants. So you take someone like President Donald Trump, who has been effective in getting what he wants, and you take someone like Prime Minister Mark Carney, who is enlightened in the area of economics. I think we got a really good matchup here, kind of like Team USA versus Team Canada in hockey. It's a classic rivalry. I think it's going to be a great one. And an effective negotiation is one where both parties win. Both parties come out with something that benefits them. Yeah, you got to give something up, but essentially you've gotten something in return that is beneficial to your side. And I think if anyone can pull this off, it's these two teams, Prime Minister Mark Carney and President Donald Trump. Team Canada versus Team USA. Great matchup, great negotiation. I think they have what it takes to pull off a mutually beneficial deal. We'll see how it goes. If I had to guess how this turns out using the analysis that we've went over here and also my own analysis that I haven't shared yet, but that I've done using Plato's allegory of the cave, I wouldn't be surprised if the two countries land on something where the tariffs imposed on Canada by the United States of America are nearly entirely lifted in exchange for a similar agreement that the Trump administration secured with Greenland. So maybe we see a framework of a future deal on Canada that includes things like American military presence in the north and also maybe mineral rights in Canada's north, in the territories, being secured by the Trump administration. We might also see an unpausing of the Permanent Joint Board on Defense, which was interestingly just paused like last week when I'm filming this anyway. Again, could be complete coincidence, but pretty close to the renegotiating of Kuzma. That's a card to play, right now with the negotiations coming up. If you were going to play that card, now would be the time, and they have. Again, all just observations, just guessing here. This is supposed to be a fun exercise to help us practice seeking clarity in the world using Plato's allegory of the cave. Again, when it concludes, we'll come back. We'll take a look at how everything panned out after the dust settles, and then I'll go over how I arrived at these conclusions by using Plato's allegory of the cave. So stay tuned for part two. I'm not sure when that's going to come out, but in the meantime, I'll keep uploading my more theoretical videos. Be sure to check those out. That's where you're going to get the real knowledge and value from this channel. We're going to go back to each of those subject matters that I first covered, social media, education, and the fog of war, and apply that theory in real life in ways that could help us incorporate more truth and love into our lives.